These images are not of an ordinary flood disaster. They are the result of one of the most cleverly planned and ruthless logistical traps in modern warfare history. Between October 25th and 27th, 2025, days of repeated and systematic attacks by Ukrainian forces on a critical reservoir dam in Russia's Belgorod region appear to have trapped the Russians in their own trenches.
Морскую пехоту. Но нам повезло, а вот на соседней позиции вообще весь блиндаж затопило вместе с аппаратурой.
Reports indicate that the dam has been breached, its gates shattered, and tons of water are flooding the Seversky Donets River uncontrollably. The tragicomic aspect is that, while tens of thousands of soldiers in Belgorod are reportedly facing the threat of drowning, and 500,000 civilians are panicking and considering evacuation, the question of where Vladimir Putin's attention lies is serious evidence of how disconnected the regime is from reality. At the very peak of this military and humanitarian disaster, on October 26 to 27th, Moscow itself was experiencing one of the largest drone attacks in its history. Putin was forced to deploy hundreds of air defense systems and even pickup trucks with machine guns to defend Moscow, but Ukraine appeared to have succeeded in breaking through the defenses. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in a statement on October 27th that the country had used its new Flamingo and Ruta missiles in combat and that more attacks were planned soon. This meant that these new capabilities could have been used in large-scale attacks on Moscow and Belgorod, potentially marking the beginning of an apocalyptic scenario for the Kremlin. There was major chaos in Belgorod. The governor had declared a state of emergency. Thousands of Russian soldiers were looking for places to flee, and hundreds of pieces of equipment were buried in the mud. So what was Putin doing in the midst of all this chaos? Russian state media announced that Putin was, proudly, watching the test of a new intercontinental ballistic missile with a range of 14,000 kilometers. Meanwhile, Lithuania was further isolating Russia by locking down the Kaliningrad border. While the EU was strengthening Ukraine, Trump was posing for peace photos with Orban and Lukashenko.
Trump заслужил эту Нобелевскую премию, ему надо было отдавать. По всему.
Putin seemed preoccupied with a phantom nuclear show of force against the US, ignoring the fires and floods within his own country. However, the air shield he had amassed to protect St. Petersburg and Moscow had been breached. Moreover, the withdrawal of defense systems from other cities to the capital indicated that Belgorod also lacked adequate defense systems. It appears that the strategic shifts observed to strengthen Moscow's defenses left Belgorod vulnerable, paving the way for this attack, which flooded thousands of Russian trenches and at least 4 Russian battalion headquarters. In these videos, which appear to have been taken by Russian soldiers and have surfaced in open sources, we see Russian shelters near the village of Grafovka, trench lines stretching for kilometers, and potential headquarters submerged underwater. This is no longer a defensive line, but a muddy water channel. A sarcastic message shared by locals on social media sums up the situation. We no longer have trenches, we have canals. Behind this dark humor lies a disaster scenario for tens of thousands of Russian soldiers on the Vovchansk Front. The main supply bridges and transit routes feeding the Vovchansk Front are either submerged or severely damaged. At least 4 Russian brigades, thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles are now trapped in this deadly trap. Their trenches, ammunition, and likely headquarters are submerged. This logistical strangulation operation appears to have been executed with methodical and flawless precision over 3 days to paralyze the Russian army on the Vovchansk Front. This is not a random attack, but a surgical operation designed to sever the enemy's logistical aorta. Ukraine's target was not the bridges or crossing points on the Russian army's main supply route to Vovchansk, which were likely heavily protected by S-400 and Pantsir systems. The target was the key point that would render these bridges and roads useless: the Belgorod Reservoir Dam, kilometers behind. This dam was a strategic piece of infrastructure that controlled the water level of the Seversky Donets River and held the entire hydrogeological balance of the region. It was reported that the operation began on Saturday, October 25th, and continued intermittently until Monday, October 27th. This 3 days of continuous pressure did not give the Russians a chance to repair the damage or organize an effective defense. According to incoming information, Ukraine may have combined two deadly weapons of asymmetric warfare in this operation. US-made HIMARS rockets to deliver precision strikes against the dam's concrete structure and key mechanisms, and possibly kamikaze UAV swarms, DART type according to some, Russian military sources, to surprise and saturate Russian air defenses and strike softer targets. 3 days of repeated strikes achieved their goal. The second major wave, reported to have arrived around 3 p.m. on Sunday, may have broken the dam's last line of defense. Open-source reports and satellite analysis confirmed that the dam's bottom water outlets and both segment gates were severely damaged or destroyed. This caused the water level in the reservoir to drop rapidly by more than a meter, and led to an uncontrolled, massive mass of water being released into the Seversky Donets River. The uncontrolled flow of water created exactly the disaster that Ukrainian planners had predicted. The Seversky Donets River quickly overflowed. The floodwaters rendered the main supply routes to Vovchansk unusable, either by destroying or submerging the main bridges. This strategic artery was now severed. The target was the dam. The result was the logistical paralysis of the Vovchansk Front. The military consequences of the breach of the Belgorod reservoir dam and the flooding of the Seversky Donets River on the Vovchansk Front can be described as apocalyptic. This is not merely a logistical disruption, but a military catastrophe that directly threatens the lives of thousands of Russian soldiers, nullifies their combat capabilities, and could lead to the collapse of an entire front line. This may go down in history as one of Ukraine's most ingenious logistical strangulation maneuvers. The number of Russian units hit by floodwaters or logistically isolated is alarming. Open-source reports and military analyses indicate that at least 4 Russian brigades, the 128th, 116th, 68th, and 136th Motorized Infantry brigades, were operating in the Vovchansk region and were directly affected by this flood disaster. In addition, other important units attached to Russia's 6th Army and 44th Corps, such as the 82nd Airborne Regiment and the 138th Guards Motorized Infantry Brigade, stationed in the occupied Gatishcha region of Kharkiv Oblast, are also understood to be at risk or isolated due to severed supply lines. This means that tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery systems are suddenly stranded in the middle of hell. The most tangible evidence of the disaster is the flooded Russian positions. The impact of the floodwaters was not limited to roads and bridges. It also submerged Russian military positions, trenches, and even potential command and control points and headquarters located along the river and in low-lying areas. It is reported that Russian positions in areas such as Grafovka, Russian side, and Gatishcha, occupied Ukrainian side, are flooded, with soldiers trapped in muddy and icy water. According to military analyst Kovalenko, these positions are no longer defensive lines, but have become inescapable traps. This situation has likely affected brigade and regiment-level headquarters in the area. The chain of command may also be submerged. The most critical military consequence of the disaster is the destruction or rendering unusable of the main supply and transit routes to the Vovchansk Front, possibly including the main bridge, by floodwaters. This means that ammunition, fuel, food, water, and medical supplies can no longer be delivered to the trapped units. Alternative routes are reportedly impassable due to flooding and mud. These units can no longer fight. Their tanks are out of fuel, their guns are out of ammunition, and their soldiers are at risk of starvation and dehydration. The heavy equipment is stuck in the mud and unable to move. Worse still, the retreat routes are also closed. This is a situation of encirclement and suffocation. Thousands of soldiers may have been left to die between Ukrainian fire and rising waters. This is considered a serious disaster for the Russian army. Why is Ukraine's move to target the Belgorod Dam and cut off Russian supply lines on the Vovchansk Front considered such a brilliant and asymmetric move in terms of military strategy? This operation demonstrates not only Ukraine's ability to adapt on the battlefield, but also how well it has analyzed Russia's strategic weaknesses. Traditional military logic dictates that cutting a supply line usually requires directly targeting the most critical node of that line, namely the bridge. However, knowing this logic, the Russian army was likely protecting the main bridges and crossing points, supplying the Vovchansk Front with layered air defense systems. Attacking these protected targets would have been both costly, wasting expensive missiles, and risky for Ukraine. Ukraine's strategy, however, was based on bypassing this defensive wall rather than breaking through it directly. The target was an infrastructure element kilometers behind the front lines, less defended, or one that Russian commanders would not think of, the Belgorod Dam. This is classic asymmetric warfare. Instead of countering the enemy's strength with strength, it involves finding an unexpected weak point and collapsing the entire system. The genius of the operation may lie not only in the choice of target, but also in the weapon used. Ukraine did not use massive bombs to destroy the dam. By precisely striking the dam's gates and spillways with HIMARS and drones, it unleashed the kinetic energy of millions of tons of water accumulated in the reservoir. It turned nature's own power, namely the flood disaster, into a weapon against the Russian army. The destruction achieved with a few precise strikes spread over a much wider area than hundreds of bombs could have created and left much more lasting damage. The floodwaters rendered not only the targeted bridge unusable, but also alternative crossing points, trenches, positions, and even potential headquarters along the entire riverbed. The dam's ability to be hit 3 days in a row also exposed a serious vulnerability in Russia's air defense system, a blind spot. There are two possible explanations for this. Either the air defense in the Belgorod region was inadequate against such coordinated HIMARS and drone attacks, or, more likely, critical S-400 and Pantsir systems in the region may have been dismantled and moved to the capital due to strategic shifts observed to strengthen Moscow's defenses. This could have left areas vital to the front line, such as Belgorod, defenseless. Analysts assess that the price of these defense assets piled up in Moscow may be the brigades trapped in Belgorod. Ukraine perfectly identified this strategic priority mistake by Russia and struck from this blind spot. This move also revealed the brutal symmetry and psychological dimension of the war. In June 2023, Russia's detonation of the Kakhovka Dam, flooding the Dnieper River and attempting to halt Ukraine's southern counteroffensive, caused a major ecological and humanitarian disaster. This attack on the Belgorod Dam can be seen as a strategic retaliation for what happened in Kakhovka. What was the reaction of the Kremlin and local Russian officials to this enormous military and humanitarian crisis created by Ukraine targeting the Belgorod Dam? The reactions that followed once again exposed the panic, helplessness, and lies told to the people that the regime has fallen into. This is the anatomy of a collapse on the home front. When the scale of the disaster became too great to conceal, Belgorod Regional Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov was forced to confirm that the dam had been damaged by Ukrainian attacks and had begun to leak. However, immediately after this limited admission, the Kremlin's propaganda machine kicked into gear to conceal the real military consequence of the disaster. The main supply routes to the Vovchansk Front had been cut off, bridges had been destroyed, and most importantly, tens of thousands of soldiers were trapped underwater. Attempts appear to have been made in the local Russian media to explain the damage to the bridge or roads with ridiculous excuses such as technical problems. However, in the modern age, where the spread of civilian videos, satellite images, and images of soldiers leaking from the front, such as trenches, underwater, cannot be prevented, these cover-up efforts were immediately exposed. The Kremlin has once again proven that it cannot control even a massive military disaster on its own soil, and has been caught lying to its people. The governor's helplessness and panic, hiding the civilian dimension of the disaster, was impossible. Governor Gladkov's declaration of a state of emergency in the region and his recommendation for the urgent evacuation of more than 10 settlements in the Shebekino district was an official admission that the situation was out of control. The angry ramblings attributed to Governor Gladkov allegedly reflected on social media. Phrases such as "damn, AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine, strike," laid bare the shock and helplessness experienced by the local administration. Moscow, meanwhile, remained largely silent in the face of this disaster. Putin was busy with other matters while this chaos unfolded. The regime's impotence and lies provoked a reaction from the local population. The sarcastic comments shared on social media about the images of flooded Russian trenches, such as, "We no longer have trenches, we have canals," are a painful example of how the regime and the army's reputation has been reduced to zero in the eyes of its own citizens. The people saw their leaders' lies and mocked them. This is more than a propaganda failure. It could be the breaking of the regime's bond with its people. This disaster will further increase the despair in the Belgorod and Bryansk regions, which are already struggling due to Ukrainian attacks, power outages, fuel shortages, and Moscow's indifference. The people have seen once again that the regime cannot protect them and has abandoned them to their fate. This situation could further fuel internal unrest and anger toward the Kremlin in the region. Strategic redeployments to protect Moscow have weakened Belgorod's air defenses. This vulnerability allowed Ukraine to strike the dam with asymmetrical brilliance, and this strike trapped and suffocated 4+ Russian brigades on the Vovchansk Front in a logistical trap. This logistical blow could not only halt Russia's advance in Vovchansk, but also lead to the complete collapse of the front. With their supply lines cut, their positions flooded, and their command structure severed, the combat capability of the 4+ brigades has been reduced to 0. These units now appear to have only 2 options: a chaotic and heavily loss-filled retreat attempt, if possible, or mass surrender. Ukraine has seized the initiative on this front and may be preparing to bring Russia's spring offensive in Kharkiv to an end. As a result, by repeatedly striking the Belgorod reservoir dam between October 25th to 27th, Ukraine did not merely cut off a bridge or supply route, it also buried Putin's entire plans for the Vovchansk Front. Thousands of his soldiers, their carefully dug trenches, their probable headquarters, and the Kremlin's pitiful lies in the muddy waters of the Siversky Donets River. Now thousands of Russian soldiers are waiting for their uncertain fate in their flooded positions on the Vovchansk Front. While their leader Putin is preoccupied with missile tests, they are drowning in the mud of Belgorod. The rising waters may be drowning not only Belgorod and the Vovchansk Front, but also the entire Putin regime, which has lost its credibility. Thank you for choosing us.